Okay, so I was acknowledging Arundhati Roy, and I was acknowledging that she's a graduate of the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, though we know her as an author. And as the author of the prompt for this series, the invitation to consider this time, this moment, as a portal. So Arundhati Roy wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. She writes, we can choose to walk through it, dragging our carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I respond to this prompt as an architect, as a faculty member in Architecture and Environmental Studies, and as director of the School of Architecture and Environment and an associate dean in the College of Design at the University of Oregon, but noting though that my views are my own only. I'm going to illustrate my remarks with images of my architectural work. This work is carried out under the framework of my design research and critical spatial practice, FLOAT, and also illustrate this with some student work. And I'll caption these images as best I can. And you can find more context, things like project statements, additional acknowledgements, and references on the FLOAT work website that I understand is in the chat. So even in this global, this virtual space, we can still do a bit of a we are here. So I'm here at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon. And here in Eugene, we're located within the traditional homelands of the Southern Kalapuya, where descendants of the Kalapuya are currently citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. This moment, I'll say I'm here in Oregon, which is an extraordinary place and an extraordinary moment. It's a place of extremes, a place of tremendous wealth, of tremendous unmet human need, of a groundswell of social progressiveness, and also a groundswell of fear and hate. And as a first step toward truth-telling, toward reconciliation, I acknowledge that I'm doing my work here on a foundation of very recent white settlement and of the very recent violent displacement of Indigenous people. I acknowledge that I'm doing this work on an economic foundation of institutionalized racial exclusion and also resource extraction. I'll say that I also do my work in the company of outstanding colleagues, students, and community members who are at the forefront of environmental, racial, and spatial justice, with a nod to the just announced paradigm-shifting Institute for Racial and Climate Justice at the University of Oregon, and a nod to current and visiting faculty fellows in design for spatial justice in the School of Architecture and Environment, who are also sharing their own work in talks this week. So this moment, though, I shake my head because so much hangs in the balance right now. We're here during a pandemic, one that's amplifying disparities in wealth, in safety, in access to medical care, and access to education. Even more seriously, if this is possible, we're here too at a moment when climate change is almost too much to look right in the eye. We're here at a time when all of the inconceivable, terrible impacts that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecast and graphed very tidily in their assessment reports. We're here at a moment when all of these things are coming to pass one after another, and also all at the same time. Listing them's too much, because to acknowledge the loss and the injustices because of climate change exceeds at least my own capacity for grief on this scale. That said, the kinds of grief and loss that climate change and pandemic disease represent came first some time ago to this continent and to other colonized places. So this kind of loss and the challenge that it brings is much more new to the colonizer than it is to the colonized. But a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. A portal is a thing you go through, a doorway from one universe to another, or it's a thing you look through, a lens or a loop. A portal changes the way you perceive things fundamentally. A portal changes your relative position. It changes your relative viewpoint. Let's do a little more we are here. Let's check in on where we each are, where you are. So I'm going to focus on you for a minute. I invite each of you to consider the space you're currently inhabiting, your actual viewpoint, looking away from the screen. So architecture questions. Right now, where is your body relative to where the sun sets? On what are your feet or your bottom rooted? What are you standing on or sitting on? What is the structure around you and beneath you? And how does that structure connect to the real ground beneath you? And how is the physical positioning of your body in the world, as shaped by the design structures you're inhabiting, shape the way you see your world? So maybe literally, how does it shape what you do and you don't see? What do you see and what don't you see? This is your portal, and this is your relative viewpoint. Still checking in on the spaces that you're in. How does the design of the space that you are in shape your relationships with others? More specifically, who is allowed in your spaces? Who's not allowed in your room, in your street, your neighborhood, your city, your country? Who's allowed in? Or to expand that a little bit, with what species do you share these spaces? In our human-centered worlds, this one requires some imagination. How is the structure of your designed environment at the scale of the room, the building, the city, the landscape, organizing your physical relationship with birds? How is the structure partitioning your relationship with insects? I'll bet that the space that you're in is designed very specifically to organize your relationship with insects. Thinking of all of our window screens and our foundation detailing and all the efforts we go to separate ourselves. So to build on this, I have to ask you too, how is this architecture organizing your relationship with your microbiome, the microbiology of your home or even of your body? I'm giving a nod here to the work done at the University of Oregon by my extraordinary colleagues in environmental studies and in the School of Architecture and Environment on the microbiology of the built environment and the body. Their work is really making visible the species with which we share our space and our bodies, and the microbiota that we share with one another. And I'm also giving a nod to the way that the pandemic is making it even more clear that separating where one living thing begins and where one ends in our cloud of a microbiome is an impossibility. We're sharing an ecosystem, a microbiome, and that microbiome is sharing us. That's a beautiful inseparability in a way, and also I think a rather terrifying inseparability and interdependence. Speaking of interdependence or inseparability, let me ask you about water. Where you are, focusing on you again, where is the line in your architectural space between the water of your body and the water of your home watershed or your atmosphere? Is there really a clear distinction? Or is there any separability between the health, the relative pollution of your body, and that of your air and watershed? That's clear in Flint, Michigan, and in all the places that Flint, Michigan stands for. May I offer the view that the air and watersheds you inhabit are also indivisible bodies themselves that are also indivisible from you. I'm going to offer some principles. Design and resistance, principle number 1. Design to recognize interconnection at all scales. Design relationships that are reciprocal. Design to recognize the indivisible, messy, inseparable whole. So as I invite you to reflect on your so-called individual body in the designed environment, I offer a few observations. We've designed and built these environments in ways that reflect and reinforce to an extreme the value systems of this moment. Each of these dwellings, workplaces, cars, tents that you're currently inhabiting are manifestations, they're physical artifacts of the very particular environmental and social ethics of our time, or of the time in which they were built. The rooms and buildings and landscapes are manifestations of the power structures, the social structures, the economic structures within which we exist. Unfortunately, the built environment that I'm guessing most of us are inhabiting, that I'm inhabiting, reflects and reinforces systems that place much power in the hands of few. So think of the defensible fortresses, read the neighborhoods, of wealth and power that we have built. It's a built environment that truly doesn't account for the multi-species interdependence. That's our ecosystem, food system, our whole well-being. Think just as one example of our many-scaled myopias of the designing out from our designed environments of pollinating insects. It's also a built environment, buildings, infrastructure, transportation, that's designed around cheap energy. So moving our mind's eye out of the spaces that you're in now and inviting you into a different kind of space, the space of the fossil fuel industry, specifically the space of fossil fuel transportation in the Pacific Northwest of North America. So I'm going to use some student drawings from a recent studio to illustrate the spatial typology, this kind of space in the Pacific Northwest. So in North America, the Pacific Northwest region sits directly between enormous geological reserves of fossil fuels in the interior. So this is coal mounts, oil shale, tar sands, and natural gas fields. It sits between these reserves and the Pacific ports along the Pacific coast for export of the fuels to Asia. So the expanding energy markets in Asia and then the availability of the fuels in North America has put pressure on the existing fuel transportation infrastructure across the Pacific Northwest. So 5 refineries are now receiving or plan to receive crude oil by rail car from the Bakken Shale Formation in North Dakota. Railroads are moving 40 times more oil now than in 2008. And then since 2012, the Pacific Northwest has faced proposals for 4 new coal export terminals on the Pacific coast, 2 new oil pipelines, 11 oil by rail facilities, and 6 new natural gas pipelines with liquefaction for export. So this is on top of the distribution systems for local industrial use of fossil fuels in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a drawing by former student Will Searcy showing 9 Pacific Northwest ports that either already ship petrol or are under consideration for development in the Pacific Northwest to illustrate this. So obviously, the lines and the pipelines are critical to the future of the global climate. They're also a unique morphological, meaning defined by their shape, category of space, defined by enormous length, slenderness, think rivers, roads, and pipelines, relative invisibility, not right in our backyards, most of us, and transcendence of ownership boundary, not the usual study site. So they're also defined as much by the periodic disruption of the spaces by bridges, stations, ports, or protests. And when I say protests, I'm thinking of, for example, the vegetable garden that Extinction Rebellion members planted on the train tracks, blocking oil trains. And I'm thinking of various flotillas of kayakers blocking tankers, etc. I know there's more examples. So protest, spatial aspects of protest, of resistance are really interesting. So let's talk about pipelines in particular. They're really hard to build across the Pacific Northwest. The Northwest is the nearly impenetrable thin green line, crediting the Sightline Institute for the phrase, that forms the boundary between the sources of extraction and the pathway to market for fossil fuels. The region is mountainous and also happens to have accumulated, not coincidentally, a lot of wealth and people who don't want to put up with the oil industry in their viewshed in the major existing the easiest transportation corridors, the river valleys, the best ports, Portland, Vancouver, Seattle. So if you want to find a path of least resistance for your new pipeline, you're limited to a very few isolated routes. This is really different, I'm given to understand, from planning pipeline construction in the Great Plains, for example, where topography doesn't pose as much of a challenge. on that more relatively smooth ground, if one county or city doesn't want a pipeline, you can just shift a bit smoothly one way or another, ending up threading right through the communities that are most disenfranchised, maybe because of this, threading right through tribal land, as we've seen with the Dakota Access Pipeline and others. So here in the Northwest, protesting fossil fuel transportation is a little bit easier. If you block a train, a pipeline, a port, there are fewer ways around. There's pinch points. And I'm illustrating this by a collage and drawing by former student Susanna Davey that illustrates both in red transportation routes across the Pacific Northwest and export routes across the Pacific, also illustrated with this aspirator of coal dust, and then also potential pinch points of blockage along that line. Design and resistance principle number 2, find the pinch points. Where can you apply a little bit of pressure for a lot of consequence? So I just showed you drawings of fossil fuel space. This is architectural drawing. Critical architectural re-representation to study a kind of space. In doing that, it emphasizes or magnifies the fossil fuel space. Given that, I want to acknowledge the power of drawing, of map making. When we represent something, when we choose to document or draw something, we give it power. So likewise, when we leave something out of a drawing, when we leave something off of a map, we've removed its power, we've removed its agency. So you can see the space of fossil fuel transportation represented by the fuel, the pipelines, the ports, and in this drawing, the compressor stations. This is the disembodied natural gas compressor stations that keep the pressure up through the pipeline across Oregon, existing ones. But what does it leave out? Is there a way that we can use drawing to include and reclaim the aspects of the land, watersheds, biotic communities that are made vulnerable by the rather toxic, factually explosive infrastructure of fossil fuel extraction? So what if in architecture, instead of drawing cities, read humans, wealth, instead of drawing property lines, read ownership, roads, usually the first built for natural resource extraction out here, pipelines. What if we draw the ecological human and non-human material whole? Or how could we draw the ecological human and non-human material whole? So I want to pause to explain about the principle of eminent domain in the building of pipelines. So eminent domain is the right of a government to expropriate private property for the purpose of benefiting the public good with just payment. So this is the principle on which it is possible to, with some sort of payment, override private property to piece together land to build infrastructure, roads, energy infrastructure, and the principle on which the natural gas pipelines are proposed. But I love that my former student, Eric Wadman, realized that in fact, eminent domain, while he didn't agree with the use of eminent domain to, for example, claim private land on behalf of a Canadian energy company to move fuel through communities that would never see it. He did like the idea of using eminent domain or the public good to claim property for, in this case, he's illustrating a habitat greenway, a habitat corridor that connects in Eugene, he proposes speculatively, the Mackenzie watershed and the Willamette watershed. And if you know Eugene, you can see that he's collaged in a greenway right over the Gateway Mall in Interstate 5. So here a drawing has great power to show a different kind of vision. Because the inclusion of different kinds of information gives power to different values. So here's an experiment in doing that, reclaiming the media of architectural representation. So in this case, this is 3D printed topographical models. So I'm showing images of a project in which we remap this same space of fossil fuel transportation. So it's the same space I was just showing you. Mostly Southern Oregon, mostly around the proposed route of the Pacific Connector pipeline. But it also includes some other impacted land, Canadian Pacific watersheds, the Dakotas. So this is a body of work of small topographic models of the space of fossil fuel transportation that's planned for exhibition for the European Cultural Center exhibition, Time, Space, Existence, to open with the Venice Architecture Biennale this summer in Italy. So here mocked up for the Palazzo Mora. So these models are topographies, landforms, but described not geologically, but spatially and also temporally to show tides, solar warmth, salmon runs, hydrological cycles. The topography is generated by data, so in XYZ coordinates, usually relational data, over seasons and years relative to physical space. So this is a remapping, systematic remapping of the space of fossil fuel transportation that's intended to demonstrate the value of land in terms of ecological holism, nutrient cycling, habitat biodiversity, rather than in terms of extraction and profit. So the new topography should demonstrate the human experience of time as cyclical in weather and water levels and as material decays and accumulates. And in this way, the new topography should draw attention to the simultaneous ecological past and the future of those lands. So there's meant to be two things going on here. One is the choices that we're making about what kinds of things to represent. So we're giving form to things we believe have the most real value. This is value not in terms of commodities or ownership, but in terms of the ecological whole. For example, I'm choosing to map value in terms of winter bird migration rather than an extraction, or to include the corporal form of the bird itself in our inventory of value, to choose and give form to reproduction over harvest, to relationship over resource. So this is design and resistance principle number 3. Give agency to things of the most true perpetual value. Emphasize cycles, renewal in the non-human whole. Disempower through exclusion, the superficial and the short term. So I've been describing land ecosystems that are defined by cycles and by ecological holism. I've also been interested for a long time in renewing cycles in architecture and in buildings. So for example, in the Issei Jingu Shrine in Japan, that's perpetually rebuilt every 20 years. So now in its 61st rebuilding cycle, you can do the math. Using wood from trees from a forest, here from a visit with the forester to the forest, that's managed to renew alongside that same construction schedule. So this is a kind of nutrient cycling in buildings for a longevity that depends on a renewing impermanence. And I've been interested in my own work in what it means to design buildings, both for their construction and their deconstruction, to have the ends of the lives of buildings be as purposeful as their beginnings. And I've been interested in material cycling in buildings in general, the idea of building in ways that participates in the good kind of nutrient cycling rather than in some kind of using up. I've also been interested in buildings as habitats for species other than or in addition to humans. And I've always loved the courtyard at Frida Kahlo's Blue House in Mexico City. Maybe you have been there or seen a picture that has clay jars set into the masonry parapet that house swallows that feed on the insects that gather around the courtyard fountain. And this project, I built a hibernaculum, an underground snake habitat under it. I'm not sure it worked, but the birds and the insects, once a lizard and a few days ago a frog, really like the in-between spaces of this project. So that's behind these kinds of sketches. This one, the idea of a circular cross-section of a pavilion, roofed in a spiral with some kind of thatch, where only one side of the cross-section is decent shelter for humans, and where the other side is habitat for other things, capturing water and nutrients, rotting, good kind of rotting. A continuum of nutrient cycling, subverting the hierarchy of human inhabitation, making multi-species habitat temporary. So I had the opportunity to design and prefabricate three pavilions based on this sketch, skipping over a lot of design and iteration we went through to get this right, and to install them in protest last year along the proposed routes of the Pacific Connector pipeline. So here's some prototypes. And for those of you who are interested, it's a triangulated truss with pretty complicated layering of the members, essentially 2 hexagons offset. I'm going to shout out to Mike Quillos and team on this one. So here's the basic diagram of that sketch in real life, with the idea that with the spiraling loose thatch, the one side sheds rain. That's the side that maybe is better human shelter. And the other side, where the thatch is in conventional terms upside down, is terrible human shelter, but maybe collecting water and nutrients and making some habitat of some kind, maybe microscopic. Okay, so the Pacific Connector Pipeline is a 36-inch diameter, 229-mile natural gas pipeline that's proposed to carry fracked natural gas from existing pipelines in Central Oregon across hundreds of water crossings to a liquefaction facility at Jordan Cove on the Coos Bay. Many of you know this. This is a pipeline that's been proposed for years, with a FERC, a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, meeting about it today. Today was a roller coaster. It was alarming that this meeting was scheduled today on the last day of this presidency, as the industry tried to push through 12 different projects on the last day of this administration. But in the face of potential federal overrides of state permit denials, today the FERC denied the Jordan Cove LNG's request to waive the state of Oregon's denial of the water quality certification. So getting into details, this is a big win for those opposing the construction of this natural gas liquefaction plant. And to quote Chairman Don Gentry of the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahoo-Skin tribes, the FERC decision is very encouraging. It's certainly our hope that Pembina, that's the Canadian gas company, will give up on this devastating project once and for all. So what a day this is, what a 24 hours this is. So I don't think that I need to say, but I will, that I also think that the new construction of infrastructure to support fossil fuel extraction is a terrible, terrible idea. That it is the definition of short-term profit for a very few individuals at immeasurable long-term expense to the climate, to our shared atmosphere, to regional habitat, to fisheries, to our ability to move beyond dependence on subsidized fossil fuels. Also, the idea of this pipeline is an indefensible kind of wrong that's being duplicated up and down the West Coast and across the nation. So this is decision-making that's completely disconnected from good science and from any kind of shared intergenerational good. And this is a diagram of the 3 portals at the 3 locations on this portion of the proposed surveyed route of the Pacific Connector Pipeline. This diagram represents about 1/3 of the length of the route. So in protest of the construction of the Pacific Connector Pipeline, and in protest of the idea in general of the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, each of these 3 pavilions is constructed on land that's stewarded by community members who are actively challenging the expropriation of their land for pipeline construction. So there's 3 sites. Each of the sites is ecologically rich. One is riparian, one is wetland, one is an estuary. I would like to commend the wonderful landowners that I worked with for putting stewardship over ownership, and for having this be about the land and the region, about multi-species communities, past, present, and future. So I'll show you the 3 portals. So this first one is the salmon portal. And so at the salmon portal, if you're sitting on this bench, over your left shoulder, you can see right into the pebbled riffles of a salmon and lamprey spawning ground. And then over your right shoulder, you can see the home of the family who welcomed the salmon back to the land through labor of removing culverts and building salmon habitat to restore the run. The salmon portal is in the riparian zone at the edge of a creek. It's in the Umpqua watershed. And if let's see, I back up and say that this portal is the one that's wrapped in tule, this wonderful plant harvested on site from a pond there. And I'm really happy to hear that after our cutting that you can see here, and our use of this plant on the pavilion, the tule has grown back and the turtles are still happy. So if the pipeline is built here, it will cross the creek just downstream from this photo, and then go through the pasture that you can see through the end of the portal here. So it's salmon space and lamprey space. And the portals, they're about the space of the physically inhabiting here. I am thinking of a gathering of a group of folks who are gathered here after their arrest at Governor Brown's office in protest last year, gathering at the portal. But the portals are also about the image, not just the physical presence, not just physical participation in the space, but also, in the case of this video, in terms of being able to make visible in imagery and in photos and video of the natural cycles of the greater whole of the places that the portals are in. In this case, the solar context. Okay. The second portal, the middle portal, is the coquille portal. So at the coquille portal, over your right shoulder, you can see actually over your left shoulder, you can see water seeping up into the marshy pond. That's a stopover for migrating geese and a nesting place for marsh birds. And then over your left shoulder, you can see also family homes, multi-generational. There were frog eggs last month, and there's frogs this month. This pavilion is thatched with a soft rush, a tussock rush, Juncus ephesus, that was cut on the Haynes Inlet. So this pavilion has been a place for families and birds, particularly ducks and amphibians. And this is the seeds from the thatch material. So this one is part of a watershed, the wetland that's a flyaway stopover for migrating birds. And if it's constructed, the pipeline will cross just west of the wetland that I showed you. And I will say that the families living around this valley are already impacted by energy infrastructure. One kid told me that the hum from the transformer station that's across this wetland keeps him up at night unless he turns the TV up really loud. The justice issue. So here's some of the water and some evidence of the species that share this place. So the third, the Haynes Inlet portal. So here, over your right shoulder, if you're sitting on the bench, you can see an estuary that holds 1,000 years of indigenous fish weirs in its muds, a really good salmon run. And you can see old growth forest where the seagoing marbled murrelet nests. And over your left shoulder, you can see the branches of a fir tree that an eagle uses to spot fish. So the Haynes Inlet portal is on an estuary arm of the Coos Bay, along one of the proposed crossings of the pipeline over to the Jordan Cove, one of a number of them. So this one has quite a variety of human and non-human inhabitants, including aquatic ones, as the tide comes up in and out of the structure. It's an estuary, so it's a really long species list: marbled murrelet, egrets, geese, bait fish, salmon, crabs, bobcat, otters, bear, and bats in the thatch. The portals are intended to transform perception of these places by demonstrating their value in terms of ecological holism, nutrient cycling, multi-species sheltering, and habitat biodiversity, rather than in terms of extraction and profit. So in this way, and as they subvert extraction-based power structures, the installations are meant to embody a different measure of value of this land. And as I showed you in the diagram, in each of the portals, the thatch spirals down around the side to shed rainwater down on one side for shelter for humans, and on the other side to collect water and nutrients to be active habitat for other species at all scales. It's the pavilions we find are reasonable shelter for people, If you tuck yourself into the bench, the loose thatch that covers your side of the portal sheds some rain and holds some warmth even in winter. And the other half of the circumference where the thatch spirals upward has all the other things, rain, a bird's nest. The portals are intended to choreograph human experience of time, also as cyclical, in weather, tides, water levels, and planetary movement, and as material decays and accumulates. In this way, the pavilions are meant to draw attention to the simultaneous ecological past and future of these places. The 3 portals have been in place for about 14 months now, and the list of their mostly transitory inhabitants includes all the birds and insects, the children, a family dog, a number of family dogs, a lot of anti-pipeline activists, quite a lot of visiting university students, and the famous bats, bobcat and river otters. I think that nonviolent resistance is powerful when the fundamental wrongness of something is made most visible, and when something that's the subject of care is in the path of harm. I'm thinking of the image of the arrest of Rosa Parks and of the most wrenching images of the children of war or of displacement. And my hope is that the images and experiences of these 3 portals magnify the immeasurable good of these indivisible ecosystem communities, and that they make it impossible to miss the truth that the construction of a gas pipeline in these places is visibly, immeasurably wrong. That's not to say that the good thing in the face of harm is the portals themselves. Actually, the portals are temporary and relatively disposable. The thing of value is the land itself, the dynamic, inseparable, multi-species whole. But my hope is that the portals, as they shape human perception of the profound, messy value of these places, bring out a shared, profound sense of care for them, for the places. So design resistance principle number 4, use heart, care for a future, a place, is more powerful rooted in love than rooted in reason. Oh, I'll say a few more words on protest or resistance. So this year, a number of states passed laws criminalizing protest against, or specifically, fossil fuel infrastructure. Greenpeace explained what this means, and I'm quoting, generally, critical infrastructure bills share several common elements. 1, they create new criminal penalties for already illegal conduct. For example, turning misdemeanor trespass, a common charge for civil disobedience, into a felony. 2, they broadly redefine the term critical infrastructure to include everything from cell phone towers to trucking terminals, far greater than the fossil fuel pipelines the bills purport to protect. The bills also seek to create liability for organizations that support protesters by treating such support as a criminal conspiracy. Here we are. I have a few thoughts on this. First, this seems to represent a fierce clinging to power over environment, economy, community that's not earned. I think this is flailing last gasps of the hold of fossil fuels on the political economy. You know you're not in a good industry if you have to go to these completely absurd lengths to protect it. This is the kind of situation that nonviolent resistance is made for. The visible, so very clearly wrong overstepping of those on the wrong side of history, amplified by those who, through nonviolent resistance, bring that wrongness right out into the light. So design resistance principle number 5, use nonviolence to bring wrongness out into the light. But to respond to the prompt for this talk, to respond to Arundhati Roy, how is this pandemic, or more broadly, this moment of cascading consequences and failures to respond to the climate change or the pandemic with science, ethics, and care? How is this a portal, a gateway between one world and the next? Roy wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. My hope with the pipeline portals is that they do design to recognize interconnection at all scales, to design relationships that are reciprocal, to recognize the indivisible, messy, inseparable whole, that they give a little bit of agency to things of true, perpetual value, to include and emphasize cycles, renewal, and the non-human whole, that they disempower through exclusion the superficial, the short-term, and the one-time use. I suppose I hope that they have heart, or maybe show some earnest care for a future, a place that's more powerful, rooted in love than rooted in reason. And maybe that through nonviolence, they can bring some wrongness out into the light. And I hope that these principles might offer suggestions for a way forward out of the pandemic into finding our way through. That is, these 5 principles that I offer: to recognize interconnection, to find the pinch points, to give agency to things of perpetual value, to care, to lead with care, rooting in love, and then to use nonviolence to bring wrongness out into the light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for your work and for this presentation. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how people can follow the future of the portals and maybe the non-human species who are taking up residence there or migrating through there.
No, thanks very much for asking that. I think that that really emphasizes the 2 ways that they're meant to make a difference. One, through the physical human experience in the place, and then also, like you're suggesting, through the reporting from, right? So the documentation of the species and the weather. So I think I could put in chat, or somebody could, my Instagram, where I do tend to post things, including reports from other people too who visit. That's Erin_Moore_float on Instagram, and I cross post to Facebook as well. And that's very intentional use of social media to be amplifying this paradigm.
Yes, please.
So, hi, Sue Ellen. Thanks for asking about how visitors to the portal can learn or read about the thinking I've done about them. There's a partial bibliography on my website next to the project statement of writing by others, and forthcoming writing. I guess most I'm thinking that some of the recent publications are mostly visual and less writing, but I'll keep the website post updated. I am looking at Solmas's question. Hi, Solmas. She asks, in looking at the portal project, it seems to be intentionally designed to force the user to sit at an angle to the dominant views, making the people experience the forcefulness of the pipeline at a visceral level, and asking to elaborate on that. So one, I have to say that I didn't actually intend to make a pipeline in protest of a pipeline. The diagram came before the specific, I don't know, one-liner of having a tube in protesting the pipeline. But it is very intentional to be sitting across the diameter so that you see out both ends of the telescope and then actually into the thinner patch. And it is meant to be visceral. I think from a seating design perspective too, knowing that I'm speaking to interior architects, and that it's there, the bench starts at the kind of entry side, but ends before the side closest to the water in all of the cases. So there's a kind of holding back from that end. Okay. Carly, I should return the moderation to you.
Yeah, and there's a question here about how were tribes and nations involved in design, development, and construction and stewardship of the Portals project.
Okay, so aloha, Megan. This is not meant to be a collaboration with tribal partners. I want to acknowledge the really important parallel work that many, many, many are doing, including tribes, on planning for the ecological futures of these places, especially around fossil fuel infrastructure, and actually the role of tribes and First Nations in the US and Canada on the forefront of the impacts of fossil fuel development in the Pacific Northwest related to fisheries and other interconnections, and that acknowledge that's really, really important. but also to acknowledge that that's not a direct part of this particular installation.
Thank you. So a lot of the projects that you featured this evening, and it seems like in your work, really focus on interspecies and the non-human world. And right now, so many of us are stuck at home or stuck in very limited indoor spaces. And that exercise that you did where you had us look at our spaces and think about them through that lens. As an architect, can you imagine ways that we could shift these spaces that are quite rigid and that many of us don't have the opportunity to change right now, so that those barriers can be, I guess, a little more permeable?
Yeah, your own spaces. I think that yes, we can change them, but that the exercise of reading the values and the limits that they represent is really the first step in the kind of the literacy that I hope to expand. But yes, little things, I think, again, acknowledging what they represent, acknowledging the separations that they represent, especially around ecosystem health, is really important, including the way that we're managing our spaces and our microbial space in the pandemic.
Do you want to say anything more about that, our microbial space in the pandemic?
Yeah, no, I mean, we, one of the things that I said in my talk is that, according to my colleagues in environmental studies and in the School of Architecture and Environment, we are coexisting with this microbiome that makes it impossible to really know where one human being starts and another stops, presumably other animals as well. And I think that's such an amazing change of point of view. And I think it's an amazing change of point of view at a moment when we're madly PPEing and trying to create the membrane barriers between us in order to isolate the dangerous virus.
Thank you. We maybe we'll just do one more question and then we'll wrap things up, and people know that you can follow Erin on Instagram. You can check out this project and many others on the Float website. Erin, is there one here that you want to answer, or would you like me to choose one?
I'm really interested, though I have to think about it, the question that Adrienne Parr is asking under the name Michael Zaretsky. So she writes, would you describe the countering principles in operation in your work emerging from how the restructure otherwise very organized striated spaces as smooth spaces that take on fluid, flexible connections to land, species, and built forms? And how might the work be scaled up? So if I'm reading that right, that's a reference to the smooth and striated and the kind of descriptions of a space typology in the work of the French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari. And I'm so interested in, I was just thinking about this because I was reading Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategies. So she, an activist, an organizer who is talking about a social change strategy that is more like flocking and less hierarchical, right? So more based on relationships, less built on leaders. And I think that I'm just going to loop back around to the spatial aspect of that. So we think about that in terms of organizing or having multiple plural movements, but also in terms of how space doesn't, that when we're undermining the hierarchies of space, we might end up with some different kinds of organizations that are more relational and less striated, or in this case, the linear, as in the space of fossil fuel transportation.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Erin, for your thought and work and attention to this creative space, especially right now. Good night, everyone.